From Luke's Gospel, chapter 14, come these words. As I say, it's a lot about seats and where people sit. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. And when Jesus noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come to you and say to you, give this person your place. And then in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you're invited to go and sit at the lowest, or when you're invited, go and sit at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. When you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. So ends the reading of God's holy word. I'd like to invite us to pray. Gracious God, most of us sit at one time or another just about every day. It's a fairly ordinary act. So sitting is familiar to us. Help us to perhaps ponder a little more deeply how we sit, where others sit, and to take into our hearts that message about offering the gift of hospitality and honoring others. Bless us in the ways that you intend for us to be blessed, so that we might become more of the people you'd have us be. We ask this in your holy name. Amen. Well, when it comes to churchgoers, I've learned one thing in 16 years. I might not know where you stand on an issue, but I sure as the deuce know where you sit on Sunday. Because we are creatures of habit. But I gotta say, it's true for me just as much as it is for you. I sit in the same seat every Sunday. I just can't break the habit. We're all pretty predictable. And I think in some ways I'm wasting my breath really to be exhorting you to leave the best seats for others, because you do that every week. Front row seats with unlimited legroom, easy access to the food when it's here, seats that would fetch hundreds of dollars at the auditorium theater, seats that go begging every Sunday. The kids, of course, occupy them every so often when they come up. As do the deacons, thank you, deacons, just to make sure they still work. But basically, they often collect dust. So to urge all of you to surrender the front row pews for the sake of a stranger seems kind of silly. It took me back a little bit, recollections about real estate long ago. Lakefront property, 150 years back. Useless for grazing or growing. So you could buy it for a song. Prime real estate that no one cared a lick about. But even if we're not especially possessive about the front pews of the church, there's still some seats that I think we care a lot about. For example, the seats on the Supreme Court. Now we're talking about seats that you don't want going in just anyway. We may not insist on having ourselves sit on the Supreme Court, but we sure don't want some stranger there with strange ideas. And then there are seats closer to home, the seats of our governmental bodies that we can care a lot about too. Sometimes we care too much. It wasn't all that long ago that the idea of women in some of those seats struck fear into the populace. Well, we've come a long way, baby. And after a few female representatives and mayors and supervisors and judges, I like to think we're a little less reactive to that than we used to be. We've made progress. But there's always a new frontier, a limit beyond which we find it hard to go. As one writer, Ron Byers, put it, the list of those that we designate as strangers changes from one time and place to another, the ones whom respectable people expect to turn aside. The ones who aren't just denied the best seats in the House, they're denied any seat in the House. I like Jesus. I really do like Jesus. He offers wise counsel, deep hope, compassionate words, and courage beyond measure. But sometimes he just seems to take it a little bit too far. And he starts to rub me the wrong way. Especially when he stretches my hospitality way beyond my comfort zone. My only consolation is that he's been doing it for a long time. He was already doing it when Luke penned these words. Why else would Luke take the pains to point out in the very first verse we heard today, they were watching him closely. That's a familiar phrase. We've heard that phrase before, they're watching him closely. Whom do we watch closely? Usually folks like criminals, troublemakers, mentally ill, all of which Jesus was suspected to be at one time or another. And so they kept an eye on him. He, in turn, kept an eye on them, noticing how the guests chose the places of honor. Jesus sure was a party pooper, and an unwelcome guest sometimes, because he never knew, or they never knew, what he'd come out with. More often than not, he messed everything up. Could he leave well enough alone? Could he simply relax, have a drink, even if he had to make it himself, and let folks find their seats the way they always did, and let it be? A couple of weeks ago, I met some friends over at Eric's office on a Friday night, around 7:30, without a reservation. Bad idea. The manager shouted to us over the din that it'd be a 1-hour wait. At Eric's, it's first come, first served, if you don't have a reservation, which makes sense. But we were hungry, and so we went elsewhere, someplace where not so many had come first. First come, first served runs deep as an idea in our culture. Among white people, Mr. Phelps and Mr. Gorham came first. I won't even get into the whole Seneca story. But for the white guys, Mr. Phelps and Gorham made it to the party early. They bought up a lot of land and had towns named after them. If you got into the game a little bit later, you might have a building or a park named after you. And for those who made the scene still later, you might find your name on a bridge or a broom closet. Phelps and Gorham, no doubt, often got some of the best seats in the whole lot of houses. And the first and the foremost still get the best seats in the house. Rest assured, if we headed up to the next RPO concert, it's a good bet that the fancy box seats with the bird's eye view of the performance are not reserved for the LPNs from Strong or the Rochester Sanitation Crew. Those choice chairs go to the movers and the shakers. People like Judith Dunnington Peabody. Who's Judith Dunnington Peabody? Well, she was a Manhattan socialite who was well-bred, well-heeled, and well-off. But she had a strange habit of not staying in her seat. the seat where they all expected people like her to stay, among the rich and the famous. Judith insisted on getting up out of her seat, figuratively speaking, and going to sit with strangers. And not just people she hadn't met, but people most folks wouldn't want to meet. People like heroin addicts, New York City gangs, and men afflicted with HIV/AIDS in the 80s, back when most people were staying away out of fear. And she wasn't just holding these guys in prayer. She was holding their hands. And I gotta believe Jesus was smiling on Judith. A childhood buddy of mine once described his sins as times when he made Jesus cry. And this friend of mine had a strong sense of Jesus watching and caring. I think he does. And it's here to lighten the moment that I want to use an illustration I used long ago, but I simply have to use it twice in 16 years. Some of you will remember this, but don't spoil it. Late one night, a burglar broke into a house he thought was empty. He tiptoed through the living room, but suddenly he froze in his tracks when he heard a loud voice say, "Jesus is watching you." Silence returned. So the burglar crept forward again. "Jesus is watching you," the voice boomed one more time. And the burglar stopped again, dead in his tracks. He was terrified. Frantically, he looked all around, and in a dark corner he spotted a bird cage, and in the cage was a parrot. And he asked the parrot, "Was that you who said Jesus is watching me?" "Yes," said the parrot. The burglar breathed a sigh of relief and asked the parrot, "What's your name?" "Moses," said the bird. "Well, that's a dumb name for a parrot," sneered the burglar. "What idiot named you Moses?" And the parrot replied, "The same idiot who named the Rottweiler Jesus." I don't want to carry this too far. I don't think Jesus is ready to bite us. But he is watching, and I think he does urge us to invite strangers to the table so that they can take a bite out of the banquet of love, the banquet that I think God intends for all of us. It's amazing how many people you can fit at a table if we try. And I'm sure all of us at one time or another have done it at a holiday gathering. You got a couple of extra family members show up, whatever. And so you add one or two more chairs, and everybody scoots over a little bit. You might need to crowd a little bit closer, get to know each other a little bit better. There's always room. And you know what else? Just a practical thing with a full table. Somebody's always close enough to get the butter for you. So may God give us the courage to pull up one more chair for one more soul that needs to eat.